Hi everyone, I'm Dina Maschichi. I've been obsessed with The Wizard of Oz since I was a kid, and I've had the good luck of turning that obsession into a career as I teach The Wizard of Oz for the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Now you might have heard that introduction before, because that's usually how I introduce myself when I give these talks. I do have a couple new additions though. I recently joined the board of directors for the International Wizard of Oz Club, and I also was just in that PBS documentary, American Oz. The PBS documentary used me a whole lot to talk about how Baum was a feminist and what that meant for The Wizard of Oz, both as a piece of literature and sort of in the larger scale. All of these things come from Baum's mother-in-law, Matilda Gage. Now, if you watch the PBS documentary or you've heard Angelica Carpenter or Sally Roche Wagner talk before, you probably know a whole lot about Matilda Gage. But if you don't, that doesn't surprise me. Gage hung out with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They wrote together, they protested together, they published together, and then Gage had this idea to write a book called Woman, Church, and State. And in this book, she sort of suggests that the reason why women didn't get the right to vote is because of the church and the patriarchal influence. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton basically said, you can't say that, we'll never get the right to vote, you cannot attack the church. And Matilda Gage said, I'm gonna do it anyway. And they said, I think we need to part ways. And that is why you don't know Matilda Gage as well as you might know Susan B. Anthony. However, Matilda Gage had a huge influence on Baum and his work. Baum described Gage as undoubtedly one of the most remarkable women of her age, possessed of the highest literary ability, the brightest thoughts, the clearest and most scholarly oratory, the most varied research, and intelligent and diversified pen of any public woman in the past 20 years. Now, this isn't the only way that Gage influenced Baum. Obviously, he held her in high esteem, but she's also one of the reasons that The Wizard of Oz exists in the first place. In fact, in an interview shortly before the 1939 release of the MGM film, Baum's wife, Maud, said, Baum might have never become a children's book writer if not for Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Now, unfortunately, Matilda Gage died before The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was published, but her and Baum had this great relationship where he was made the literary executioner of her estate, and he posthumously republished Woman, Church, and State, so you really get a sense of how important this text and Gage was to Baum. Why am I bringing up Gage in a talk about Glinda? Well, in Woman, Church, and State, Gage talks about the matriarchate, or what woman rule looked like in societies that existed before the patriarchy really took hold. Through the trinity of Dorothy, Ozma, and Glinda, Baum turns this into something of a reality within Oz. He has this female rulership in his land. I use the word Trinity, and in the Christian tradition, the word Trinity implies something about the religion itself, of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so here, if we're going to make it feminine, the logical way to do that would be to talk about the maiden, the mother, and the crone. But what's interesting here is they also are different phases within life. And so it gets a little sticky, especially I'm going to talk a lot about Glinda in this talk to kind of decide who fits what, because Baum wrote primarily for children, but then you have the adults. And is Glinda a mother? Is she a maiden? Is she a crone? Well, the first time I played around with these ideas, I argued Glinda as the good mother of Oz. And I'm not sure I buy that argument anymore for a couple reasons. First, in this recent publication, Amazons in America, it talks a little bit about Baum and some of his influences, and this author credits Gage as being the influence for Glinda. Now, it does raise a really interesting thought, and that is Glinda supposed to be Gage? Is Glinda supposed to be Maud? Is Glinda uniquely her own self? There are times that she's described as young. There are times that she's described as having lived many, many years. So she can be any number of these phases. So for the sake of this talk, rather than limit her to motherhood, I'm going to really focus on female leadership instead. With all of that said, we do see a much older, a much less complicated, a much easier to cast as a crone type as our first witch that Dorothy interacts with in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And that's when Dorothy meets the Good Witch of the North. And the Good Witch of the North tells Dorothy there were only 4 witches in all the land of Oz, and 2 of them, those that live in the north and south, are good witches. Those who dwelt in the east and west were, indeed, wicked witches. But now that you, Dorothy, have killed one of them, there is but one wicked witch in all the land of Oz, the one who lives in the west. The remaining witches hover as a Chekhov's gun. We know that they're come into play later, but it's Dorothy's journey and it's her power that's central. In fact, Dorothy doesn't even remember that there are other witches until she misses the chance to fly away on the balloon with the wizard. Emerald City guards suggest that Glinda might be able to help her. "Who is Glinda?" inquired the Scarecrow. "The Witch of the South. She is the most powerful of all the witches and rules over the Quadlings." "Glinda is a good witch, isn't she?" asked the child. "The Quadlings think she's good," said the soldier. Now, I find this passage really interesting because Baum does not identify Glinda as a good witch. He leaves it a little ambiguous. I had the good fortune of talking to Michael Patrick Hearn about this. Thank you, Jane Albright, for connecting me with him. And he noted that this scene really mirrors the way the Good Witch of the North describes the wizard. And that's all well and good and true, but I still think there's something kind of worth considering here. Baum doesn't identify Glinda as the Good Witch, and in fact, when Dorothy arrives at Glinda's castle, Baum calls Glinda the Witch Glinda with no positive or negative label. Now, if we wanted to, we can poke at this a little bit, because we know that Glinda does some odd things in Baum's other books. In The Marvelous Land of Oz, she threatens to kill Mombi if Mombi doesn't cooperate and tell her what happened to Ozma. In the Emerald City of Oz, she creates an entire city for rabbits just because she's fond of rabbits. And in Glinda of Oz, she ends up taking away the thing that makes the Flatheads individual and unique, which is prized traits in Oz, in order to solve a conflict between some warring people. So this Glinda, Baum's Glinda, is not endlessly altruistic, but that doesn't mean that she isn't good. In fact, Baum titled Chapter 23 of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, "The Good Witch Grants Dorothy's Wish." While I believe his removal of the word good in the introduction of Glinda does imply something, I don't think he's trying to suggest that Glinda isn't good. Instead, I think he's going right back to Gage's matriarchate logic. So the first place that we can kind of see this hint that Glinda is supposed to represent something of the suffrage movement is the fact that her dress is described as being pure white. White was one of 3 identifying colors that the women in the suffrage movement wore to parades and marches, and it represented purity and virtue. The more interesting than just the exterior appearance of Glinda, though, Glinda is wise enough to know that the magical shoes that Dorothy's wearing can send her home. Before she tells Dorothy how to use these shoes, she says, "If Dorothy had known their power, she could have gone back to her Aunt Em the very first day she came." Though Glinda is described as a witch, she uses her knowledge, not a spell or a powder, to get Dorothy home. And this knowledge is part of what circles back to Gage in the matriarchate. In a chapter titled Witchcraft, Gage describes not only the full persecution for witchcraft, but also how the word witch formerly signified a woman of superior knowledge. Gage states that, whatever the pretext made for witchcraft persecution, we have abundant proof that the so-called witch was among the most profoundly scientific persons of the age. The word magic or wisdom simply meaning superior science. Glinda has this superior knowledge or science because she has a record book. And on the pages of which were constantly being printed a record of every event that happens in any part of the world at exactly the moment it happens. wow, internet before the internet existed. But this superior knowledge helps Glinda solve the problems and save the day more than once. Whether Glinda is playing the maiden or the mother or the crone, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, she is the adultiest adult in Oz. The male characters tend to be a little bumbling and a little lost. In fact, Glinda eventually is the one who teaches the wizard magic because he didn't have it without her. It is Glinda who really saves the day and solves the problems, and she's the one you turn to when you don't know what to do. It's sort of like Jane Albright with the club. What's the most interesting here is if you left Glinda up to her own devices, I personally think she'd just be hanging out in her palace with her record book. She seems to enjoy her solitude and her knowledge very much. She doesn't mind helping, she enjoys helping, but she is a round enough and full enough character that she has her own life, and a lot of that life is kind of off the pages of Baum's text. Which, if we're thinking again about Glinda as a mother figure or even a crone figure, makes a lot of sense. Your child characters can't possibly go on adventures and explore if they have an adult who's right over them at all times. But despite this complexity, Glinda is clearly good, or at least she would be if we stopped with Baum. While MGM made changes to Baum's tale, the most notable for this talk, screenwriter Noel Langley amalgamated the Good Witch of the North and Glinda, the Witch of the South, into one character. This also makes sense, as Langley made the Wicked Witch of the West Dorothy's primary antagonist, and as Suzanne Rand points out in The Wizard of Oz, Shaping an Imaginary World, this meant that the witch's defeat would become the natural climax, eliminating China Country, the Quadlings, and Glinda as the Witch of the South. Michael Patrick Hearns suggests that this is sloppy script edits. Glinda is the one to greet Dorothy in the beginning and send her on her way to go see the wizard, and also the one to solve her problems at the end and say, "You had the power all along, click your heels." Astute viewers start to wonder why she didn't just tell Dorothy that from the beginning. In fact, there's a wonderful Mad TV clip all about this that I show in my class when I talk about this scene, and I can't show it here. Recorded talks, you're not allowed to intersperse video that doesn't belong to you, but go ahead and Google alternate ending Oz Mad TV somewhere on YouTube, and it should pop up. Be warned, the language is neither family-friendly nor PC at all, but it really hits at this. Glinda kind of becomes morally questionable at that point. Rohar Page, in her essay, Wearing the Red Shoes, sees Glinda as an agent of the patriarchy because she advises Dorothy to seek out the wizard. Now, what's interesting, and we're going to start to talk a little bit about different academic interpretations of Glinda, and when I say Glinda, I mean really kind of the combo of Baum's Glinda and the MGM Glinda, is even when we see Glinda as an agent of the patriarchy, Baum wrote a text that had so many rich female characters in it that even the furthest version that we can argue has the least feminist content within it still passes the Bechdel test. And many films don't pass that. Now, Alison Bechdel was a cartoonist, and she created this test just to show how little equality there is within fictional representations of women, especially film. And the test is super simple. In fact, the number one critique of it is that we're asking too little. All it requires is that a work of fiction has two female characters with names that talk to each other at some point about anything other than a man. And many films, even today in 2021, fail this miserably. But I can't think of a single Oz adaptation that does, because Baum had so many rich female characters. The other thing I want to note before I get into some of what academics say is we're talking about dichotomies here. A woman is good or a woman is bad, and that doesn't work. In fact, for a little while I kicked around, I'm not a gamer, but I thought about making that Dungeons and Dragons chart that talks about different kinds of good and evil and neutral. because then we're not so limited to this dichotomy. So please keep in mind as we move through these that there is a full spectrum here, and the Glindas that we'll talk about really do end up representing all sorts of different points within the. And Rushdie argues, one can also see Glinda's obliquities as proof that a good fairy or a good witch, when she sets out to be of assistance, never gives you everything. Glinda is not so unlike her description of the Wizard of Oz after all. Oh, he's very good, but very mysterious. Now, this one doesn't sit too well with me because the implication is that a woman leader or a powerful woman is a little bit mysterious, and you have to be careful what you say. It's almost like a genie. She's not going to give you everything that you want, and if you don't watch your words, you might end up with something you really don't want. And so I find that one a little tricky. One that I kind of prefer, Alyssa Berger in Wizard of Oz, An American Myth says, it is necessary for Dorothy to learn self-reliance and independence to solve her problems for herself. Therefore, a good mother, like a good witch, never provides all the answers, instead protecting her child to the best of her abilities while allowing the daughter to learn for herself. Now, this one makes a lot more sense if we're just talking about Baum's text. The problem here is that in the MGM film, Glinda comes along and solves Dorothy's problems. First, she's the one who comes down and says, magics the shoes onto her, where Baum, Dorothy, chose to put the shoes on, and sends her on her journey, and then she sends the snow and the poppy field to save Dorothy. And so you can't really read it as a journey of independence if you have that parent figure hovering in the background, making sure nothing goes too wrong. Now, I think what's interesting here is the labels, though. Fairy godmother, witch, good, bad. Again, we're just dealing with dichotomies and trying to figure out how to label a woman in a power position who is the adultiest adult in the land. Can you imagine how we would try to label a female president? As much as I struggle with the maiden, mother, and crone, academics struggle with how to label Glinda, and I think this says a lot about how we view powerful women. So then I wonder, is the amalgamation what creates the problem? Motown's The Wiz is not a perfect film by any means, but they did untangle having the Witch of the North and having Glinda be one character. We can see what happens when we separate the two. In Motown's The Wiz, Glinda occupies a separate astral plane that surrounds her with the darkness of a seeming night sky, complete with the shimmer of numerous stars. Glinda is well beyond the realm of mortal as well, at one with the cosmos behind her. This is not to say that Glinda in The Wiz is the same as Baum's Glinda. After all, Baum's Glinda is not so far removed from her citizens as being in the cosmos, and she doesn't intervene in Dorothy's journey until Dorothy comes to her, where Horn's Glinda, the one in The Wiz, actively brings Dorothy to Oz via a snowstorm. It isn't the amalgamation. What is it that makes Glinda's goodness a question? Now, it would be impossible to cover every Glinda in every adaptation in a talk. That is an entire course that would probably take me a whole semester to go through. So forgive me, but I'm going to narrow our scope a little bit, and I'm going to narrow it to Oz's that are fairly well known, not animated. So that doesn't mean that an Oz needs to be a live action film in order to be well known. It just happens to be that my students prefer the live action to the animated, so that's where I'm a little more comfortable. If somebody wanted to build on this talk, adding the animated characters would definitely take it to the next level. Created after The Wiz and use Glinda as a central character. Now, forgive me, but before I continue the argument, I want to talk a little bit about the text I'm going to use so that if you're unfamiliar, you can have a sense of what you're getting into. We have 1982 Philip Jose Farmer's Barnstormer in Oz. Now, Philip Jose Farmer is known for writing adult science fiction and fantasy, tends to use sexual and religious themes in his work. So this is a much more adult version of Oz. And in it, Dorothy has a son, Hank, after she leaves Oz, and her son Hank accidentally flies a plane into Oz and falls in love with Glinda and impregnates a munchkin and all kinds of crazy things. Moving chronologically, the next thing that we'll talk about is the 1995 novel Wicked by Gregory Maguire. A lot of us know Gregory Maguire. He is just the best, and he wrote quite a few adaptations of fairy tales, and all of them take the evil character and kind of build a backstory for them. And so in Wicked, our central character is Elphaba, and that's how he names his Wicked Witch of the West. And you can kind of guess if Elphaba is the good character, it creates some complications for how he uses Glinda. So Glinda is Elphaba's foil in many ways. And because of this, the two girls initially clash, but they eventually learn to get along, at least in college, and then Glinda kind of chooses some different adult paths for herself. And it's interesting, since I did a talk where we focused really on the motherhood, that Elphaba has a child where Glinda doesn't actively take on that role in this story. In fact, she's a little too wrapped up in her desire for an aristocratic life, and so instead she marries an older baron named Sir Chuffrey and becomes Lady Glinda Chuffrey. While Stephen Schwartz borrows characters, setting, and many plot elements for his musical version of Wicked, he does make some changes. In many ways, Glinda remains the pretty, popular, frilly, mean girl that Maguire penned. This is probably because Schwartz keeps the bulk of his musical during Glinda and Elphaba's college years. Like Maguire's tale, Glinda and Elphaba are initially roommates who don't get along. Now, what's interesting here is Glinda, in both of these, really is half a character. Without Elphaba, she doesn't have a full role and isn't as fleshed out. Her job is to be the foil for Elphaba. So again, we have that dichotomy. While Wicked may add all sorts of wrinkles to whether or not we read Glinda as good, overall, it tends to fall within the parameters of Baum's vision. I tend to argue the opposite about 2013's Oz the Great and Powerful. This one makes the wizard the protagonist, and the three witches each have some scene or another where it's suggested they might be the love interest for the wizard. And there's something about that just doesn't sit well with a text that, again, initially especially, is so very feminist. Now, but what's interesting about just Glinda, leave all the other characters out, is this Glinda is actually pretty close to Baum's text, except for her bubbles. If Disney's Oz the Great and Powerful hides a feminist Glinda in a fairly anti-feminist text, I would make just about the opposite argument about Danielle Page's Dorothy Must Die. You have a lot of female characters, strong ones, well-rounded ones, but Glinda, not so much. So the protagonist in Dorothy Must Die is Amy Gum, this teenager sick of her Kansas trailer park life. Her mother's a drug addict, she gets picked on in school, everything's terrible. And then she's blown away to Oz, where she finds a dictator Dorothy has created a dystopian Oz in environmental peril. I mean, it's a mess. And Page chooses to flip a lot of things. So the characters we typically think of as good, like Glinda, are very much wicked and on the evil Dorothy spectrum of things. If Danielle Page's villainous Glinda can come off as cartoonish at times, the 2016 television series Emerald City offers a more morally complex Glinda. The steampunk Game of Thrones style of the Emerald City version of Oz seems to be locked in a war between science and magic. And science is very much the patriarchal wizard's domain, and magic belongs to the witches and therefore is the female domain here. And the Glinda in Emerald City drifts from being this Mother Teresa-like figure. She's called Mother of the Sound and Pure, and she runs an orphanage. And she's also a threatening, power-hungry monster type who would kill her own sister if it would mean being able to rule Oz. What's interesting is all of these texts question Glinda's goodness directly, sort of like Baum and the missing adjective. They also vary in how much power they give their Glinda. Farmer's Glinda is all-knowing to the point of being able to read minds, and Schwartz's Glinda is clearly not that girl. The first time I gave this talk, I thought it came down to whether Glinda wore white, like Baum's suffrage-inspired Glinda, or pink, like the frilly MGM exaggeration of femininity Glinda. But I don't think it's quite as simple as that. Certainly Emerald City, where Glinda wears white, complicated that for me. Talking about Glinda's looks, though, does pair very well with the MGM line about only bad witches are ugly. And certainly we see tons of memes pop up that play with that idea along with evil Glinda. So let's dive in just a smidge. Now, starting with The Wiz, what's interesting is I just wrote a Bugle article on Lena Horne as Glinda, and in it I talked a little about the dichotomies that were set up against her, especially being an African American woman during the early film years. And that's to say, she was really only allowed in so many ways to play a whore or a maid character, and had to push against that quite a bit. And we see this echoed right up to today. There was a scene in Emerald City where Ozma says to the Wicked Witch of the West character in that, "So I'm to be a nun or a whore." There is this weird dichotomy where women are expected to be chaste and nurturing and virtuous if they are good, and very seductive if they are not, and there really isn't a whole lot in between, and how extremely limiting on the woman's part to be locked into these roles that really only have to do with other people and nothing to do with the woman herself. We'll start with Baum's Glinda, who is noted as appearing young and beautiful despite her many, many years. Now, what's notable about this is even if she has superior knowledge about how to make her appearance whatever it is she wishes, she's not using this for a man. It really is the child's view of the mother. I remember listening to my mother complain about how she looked in a dress when she was getting dressed up to go out for the evening, and I would sit there on her bed thinking she was the most beautiful woman in the whole world, and how could I possibly be a beautiful woman if she looks in the mirror and doesn't see herself as pretty. Unless you have a really problematic relationship with your mother, as a small child, you usually use her as the defining thing for what is beautiful. And Baum picks up on this with his young, beautiful Glinda. And Motown plays off of this a bit because they have a beautiful Glinda in the sky, far away from everybody, no men around, lots of babies, no men. So whatever her beauty is clearly is not connected to a love interest or a male character at all. Then we have what I'm going to politely title Drag Queen Glinda. So MGM's Glinda is frilly to the point of being almost a performance piece. In his essay, My Beautiful Wickedness, Alexander Dottie suggests that he actually saw Glinda as sort of a drag queen when he was watching the MGM film. And Danielle Page echoes this in her novel Dorothy Must Die, where Page chooses to use Glinda as a flip on only bad witches are ugly. When readers first meet Page's Glinda, she's described as wearing a dress, but instead of the beautiful flowing dress that the character had worn in the book, this gown was more like armor. Thin metallic petals made up the voluminous skirt, while magenta jewels dipped and curved across the chest in a tight, plunging bodice. Now, her clothing protects her in a far more literal fashion, but it's very, very performative. Page's Glinda has all of that drag show frilliness of the MGM Glinda. Further, in a commentary on Botox, plastic surgery, or all the ways that one might augment their looks, especially to fight the aging crone, Page chooses to have her Glinda smear her lips with something called perma-smile, which forces the wearer to smile, this huge, exaggerated, ridiculous smile. Page uses this frilly, appearance-obsessed Glinda to comment on how one should not judge a book by its cover. As a munchkin tells the protagonist of the story, just because someone has pretty hair and good skin tone and a crown instead of a pointy hat doesn't mean she's not the baddest bitch this side of the Emerald City. Now, what's interesting, again, is who are these Glindas putting on their looks for? And I say that because neither Page's Glinda nor the MGM Glinda have a love story. But In the essay Dorothy and Cinderella, Agnes B. Curry and Joseph Velasquez make the observation about the MGM Glinda that I think is worth noting here. They say, "In a land populated by exceptional individuals, Glinda stands out. She is the only major figure who lacks a Kansas counterpart." Curry and Velasquez see this lack of a Kansas counterpart as proof that Glinda is intended to be the good mother figure in what they see as the feminine version of the Oedipus complex. In their opinion, Glinda's counterpart is Dorothy's mother, whom we never meet because she died. Now, this interpretation opens us up to all sorts of interesting ways of discussing what is a mother, and sort of goes back to why I want to shift away from just reading Glinda as the mother figure and look at her more as a female leader figure. And that's to say, yeah, Dorothy's an orphan, she doesn't have a mother, but there are a couple factors here that I think we need to address. The first is, if Dorothy were not an orphan, she wouldn't be going on an adventure to Oz. She would have been in the cellar because, believe me, Mama Bear is pulling her daughter right along with her. And we see this play out in some of the animated Oz's, which are geared a little bit more to the child. And that's to say, in Lost in Oz, the Amazon Prime TV series, in the very beginning, when Dorothy's being blown away, she calls her mom. And her mom tells her exactly what to do and then gets on the phone and sets it up so West is waiting for her. The mom has a role. And we see this again in The Wonderful Galaxy of Oz, where Dorothy has not only parental figures that she could talk to, but she also has this robot figure who acts as a surrogate parent for her. So again, if the adult is right there, the child is not going on the adventure. Now, with that said, we also have different representations of what a mother is within Oz. So the first one is Dorothy has her Aunt Em, who sort of functions as a mother for her. And Aunt Em is described as being a young, pretty wife with sparkly eyes and rosy cheeks until they were made gray by her hard Kansas life. And then we also have Ozma, who not only plays parent to many a person within Oz, but Jack Pumpkinhead calls her father back when she's Tip, and then eventually mother when she's transformed back into Ozma, which if you haven't read Marvelous Land of Oz and are lost, let me go ahead and recommend you Google that. Now, with all of that said, in a practical sense, one needs a love story in order to have a mother. So let's go ahead and look at some of the Glindas that actually have love stories and see what that does to the good-bad dichotomy. So, moving back to Barnstormer in Oz, Hank falls in love with Glinda almost instantly, and that becomes a major part of the plot. In fact, even when he has a sexual relationship with Munchkin, he's still lusting after Glinda. Now, what's particularly interesting here is this is Hank's tale, and it's all framed from his narration. And yet the way he frames it, it's suggested that because Glinda is so beautiful and because he's attracted to her, that she is somehow manipulating his actions because of this. Gregory Maguire's Glinda is sort of indulged and spoiled and very interested in her appearance and the outside of things. She very much wants to climb the proverbial social ladder. As Alyssa Berger notes in The Wizard of Oz as American Myth, Glinda is socially constructed as good by the wizard, as she publicly performs altruistic acts while dressed at the height of fashion. Everything becomes appearance-based in her world. Both Maguire and Schwartz's Glinda is described as depicted as the ideal feminine body, attractive and sufficiently contained. Schwartz's song Popular drives this point home, as Glinda tells not only Elphaba, but also the audience just how much work goes into being that sufficiently contained, attractive female. The maiden's power seems to fall solidly within her desirability, and certainly Maguire and Schwartz's Glinda holds this power in spades. She is dancing through life, expecting to be paired with the most desirable character. As she ages, her performance piece changes, and we see this in her regal gown and her hovering above the Ozians in a bubble, but it's still a performance piece. Is her performance male-centric, the way a love interest Glinda might be? Schwartz is quoted in the autumn 2018 Bugle as noting, "In Wicked, it's the love story between the two women. It's not a romantic love, but it is definitely a love story." So while we may read Glinda and Elphaba in any number of ways, including a between-the-lines romantic pairing, what is important to this particular talk is that Glinda's goodness is linked to her relationship with Elphaba. As Stacey Wolf notes in her essay, Defying Gravity, Queer Conventions in the Musical Wicked, even the show's logo consists of a drawing of the two witches, Glinda's eyes, Elphaba's nose and mouth, that make it seem as if both women are necessary to make a whole face. Whether it is learning to be a more genuine self or having another to perform her highly gendered performance against, Wicked's Glinda is half a character, incomplete without another to play off of. And this reflects another way that our society constructs roles. If Wicked's Glinda is incomplete without her other half, the same could be said for Glinda within Oz the Great and Powerful, except here the other half is male. So again, much like Hank in Farmer's Story, we're talking about a male protagonist love interest character, and that in of itself changes things. So you have Evanora, who is this Wicked Witch of the East, and Theodora, who is this version's Wicked Witch of the West. Sorry, spoiler if you haven't seen it. And then you have Glinda, and all three seem to have some sort of interest in Oz at one point or another. And Evanora and Theodora convince Oz that Glinda is the Wicked Witch. There's a whole which witch is the wicked one, much like Wicked. And then Oz chooses to go off and try to stop Glinda, the evil Glinda, until he sees her. This Glinda has a Kansas counterpart, Annie, who, oddly enough, is Dorothy's mother. So that goes right back to that Velasquez-Curry article I was talking about. But what's interesting here is that the fact that this Glinda looks like Annie is what saves her life. Her looks save her life and gain the wizard's love. It's also interesting because the wizard's love is what ultimately helps her save her land, because he needs to actualize the prophecy in order for these witches to be defeated. And that's not to say he needs to actualize it by performing magic. He just needs to convince the people of Oz he is the wizard. There's this very weird illusions are good kind of theme running through. And this gets even more complicated when we consider that Disney ran through many drafts of the script, and there is an earlier draft where Glinda refuses the wizard's kiss, saying that her kiss would kill him. However, in the script that the audiences actually see, Glinda's kiss becomes the reward for the wizard's character growth. So even though this Glinda argues that bubbles are just for show, who is she putting on her show for? While Baum's Glinda was young and beautiful, her lack of a love interest helps untangle this just a bit. Her looks have nothing to do with a male character and nothing to do with moving the plot forward with a love story. So Glinda's beauty doesn't seem connected to her goodness, her age, or whether or not she's a love interest. However, this whole idea of Glinda as a love interest is the most used subplot in any of the texts that we're discussing, including in the TV show Emerald City. Emerald City creates a love triangle between Dorothy, Glinda, and their scarecrowish character that they call Lucas part of the time and Rowan part of the time. He had some memory loss, it's a whole thing. And even though Dorothy and Glinda are kind of in a battle of survival, clashing with each other, clashing with the wizard, everybody's clashing, they still spend the bulk of episode 8 trying to figure out who Lucas Rowan is in love with. And that in of itself is a pretty weird plot point, especially when you consider that they're trying to kill one another. Now, what's the most interesting about Glinda's looks is not how pretty she is, but how it's used within the stories. And so Glinda is always a beautiful character, but there's definitely a question of what does she do with this advantage? One arching theme that relates to whether Glinda is good or not so good has to do with how manipulative a character she is. And this becomes complicated when we consider Glinda's looks, because whenever we're dealing with a male protagonist character and he's dealing with beautiful Glinda, then it becomes a plot point of, is she manipulating him with her looks? In the autumn 1994 Baum Bugle, Robert Lors noted that the Wicked Witch of the West primarily seeks through her magic to dominate or destroy others. A manipulative Glinda seems to act in the same manner. Now, the previous incarnation of this talk, I talked about a free-range parent, which, if you're not familiar with the term, is someone who sort of lets their kid run around unsupervised or less supervised, and a lawnmower parent, who is someone who, if you think of a lawnmower pushing and making a perfect path of grass, that's what a lawnmower parent is. They're pushing their way and giving you the path to walk down, and there is no other way to go. So again, a dichotomy. Now, while I'm not going to talk about parenting, again, if we think of leadership, it becomes interesting to sort of apply this and Robert Lors' quote to Glinda and see if this unlocks the key to whether or not any version of Glinda is good or not so good. Now, starting with Baum, what's interesting is his version of Glinda's fairly handsome. Consider in Glinda of Oz, where Glinda's advice to Dorothy and Ozma is to pay no attention to these warring people within Oz. Baum's Glinda is not getting involved unless she's asked to be. And this seems something that sets her apart from nearly every adaptation we've discussed. In MGM, again, we have Snow Glinda rescuing Dorothy. In The Wiz, we have Glinda actively bringing Dorothy to Oz with the tornado, or snownado. What would it be? Farmer's Glinda is described as having an iron control of her people. Via Hank's narration, Farmer's Glinda is accused of writing the words on the Good Witch of the North slate that tell Dorothy to go to the wizard, animating and making the scarecrow sentient so that the little girl might have a protector and advisor, transferring Nicholas the Chopper's persona into a tin body because she wanted him to accompany Dorothy to the land of Oz as an advisor and protector in order to eliminate the West Witch and get rid of that humbug, the Great Wizard of Oz. Fire's character isn't as powerful as a lot of these other Glindas. She's powerful. She's the one who enchants Nessarose's shoes, the shoes we all have a bit of a shoe fetish for, but she's not all powerful. In fact, she's sort of questing out for power. And it's this quest for power that makes her a little bit manipulative. In fact, when Madame Morrible, the headmistress at Elphaba and Glinda's school, suggests to Elphaba, her sister Nessarose, and Glinda that she would like to name them, to baptize you, as it were, as a trio of adepts. In the long run, I would like to assign you behind-the-scenes ministerial duties in different parts of the country. Let us say you would be secret partners of the highest level of government. You would be ambassadors of peace, helping to restrain the unruly elements among our less civilized populations. Glinda sees this as a chance at an aristocratic life. She completes her sorcery degree and later marries an older baron named Sir Chuffrey and becomes known as Lady Glinda Chuffrey. And she becomes famous for her philanthropy, working in tangent with her husband's business deals. When Elphaba and Glinda cross paths at the end of the novel, Elphaba is disappointed to find that the ugly skillet snobbery had returned to Glinda in her middle years. While this Glinda doesn't seem as evil as others, if we use that dominate and destroy quote as our framing device, we could see how this Glinda doesn't fall on the solidly good side of the spectrum. We can see how this mean girl behavior falls under that umbrella. Schwartz seems to offer his Glinda a tad more power because she's the one who opens by narrating the tale. So suddenly this is going to call some of those manipulations like Lena Horne causing the snowstorm to bring Dorothy into Oz, or Farmer's Glinda, who is just all kind of powerful and knowing and very, very manipulative, because this Glinda gets to frame the tale. But even though this Glinda has the power to just frame for the audience who is good and who is wicked, in many ways she's still that pretty, popular, frilly, mean girl that Maguire penned. Brian Atterbury points out in The Fantasy Tradition in American Children's Literature, a magical transformation is harmful if it is imposed on an unwilling victim, but beneficial if restoring an original form. This returns us to the question of what Glinda's true identity is. Is her transforming returning to an original form, or an altering of the true self? And this is even more complex when one considers how Schwartz makes it very clear in the song For Good that Elphaba and Glinda both changed and transformed each other. Now, here's what's interesting about Glinda as the narrator, though. Glinda changes the tale, especially if we consider Maguire's ending versus Schwartz's ending, to give Elphaba a happy ending. And she does this while respecting Elphaba's boundaries that she not tell everybody in Oz that Elphaba really was the good one. Her manipulations right wrongs while respecting her friend's boundaries. We seem to be creating a spectrum. The evil Glindas manipulate things for their own powers. They want to dominate or destroy. The good Glindas aren't terribly interested in power or pushing an agenda. They respect the wishes of others. If this is true, then Glinda in Oz the Great and Powerful would be our best Glinda. And by that, I do not mean the Glinda that I like best. I mean the Glinda who actualizes goodness to the highest degree, because she helps the wizard discover his goodness while saving her people. Interesting is that even though this Glinda plays that maiden love interest, she also is our clearest version of Glinda as the mother. And we see this through her relationship with the China girl and numerous mom lines like, "You're hurting him," and "Now you two stop it," and her relationship with her people. In fact, this Glinda's all about getting the wizard to save her people. And she acknowledges, because there's this prophecy that says the wizard's going to do it, she can't just go in and save it herself. She really needs him to actualize this prophecy. So she saves him, and they travel via bubbles through this magic wall that she'd created. And during that time, he starts to contemplate his goodness, because she says that only good people can pass through the wall. And it's interesting because you could see this as a manipulation, but she's not manipulating him to get him to do something. She wants him to realize something about himself. It's thought rather than action that she's trying to manipulate, which would be questionable, except his whole goal is to be a great man and do something great. So he wants to actualize this prophecy for her. Now, once they land, Glinda introduces Oz to the people of her land in hopes that they can form a resistance army against the witches. While it would be easy to lump this in the male savior category, there's something really interesting that echoes woman, church, and state here that I want to point out for us all. Glinda tells Oz she wants him to lead an army that can't kill, and this is very similar to something that Gage says in Woman, Church, and State, when Gage says, "People who possess the mother rule excel in their love of peace and justice." So while this Glinda can be read as needing to be saved by a man, I think what's more interesting is she really plays the woman behind the man. She has the power. In fact, we see this when she takes down Evanora on her own. But she guides Oz to the role that both he wants and the prophecy wants for him. She plays that gentle guide, that nurturing mother. This Glinda is comfortable enough with her own power to give her people what they need, even to her own detriment. And really, in the grand scheme of things, what could be more mother-like than that? In fact, if we think of it as the mother goddess or the powerful woman leader, a lot of texts tend to link a woman's power and nature. There's a whole branch of study called ecofeminism that delves into this. And the fact that this Glinda can call up fog and uses it to help her people and her army definitely relates. Now, if Disney's Oz the Great and Powerful offers us the best Glinda, or the most in line with Gage Glinda, or the most altruistic Glinda, then Daniel Page's Dorothy Must Die offers a complete opposite Glinda. From her first entrance, she's cast as the bad mother, and she tells the Munchkins, "There is no crying, little ones," while forcing them to mine the land for magic. Glinda does not care for her little ones. This Glinda enslaves them. If Baum meant Glinda to suggest Southern worship of genteel womanhood, as Brian Atterbury suggests, then Page's Glinda is both a reminder of how those genteel Southern women treated their slaves a handful of years before Baum penned Oz, and a comment on the modern fracking industry. Her list of crimes continues throughout the series. In Page's second novel, The Wicked Will Rise, Page openly states that Glinda brought Dorothy to Oz in order to be a pawn ruler. But with all the turmoil in the land, Glinda's hold on power had been dwindling, and she had thought that young and inexperienced Ozma would make a suitable pawn. She was incorrect. And so, being unable to rid herself of the princess, Glinda arranged for Dorothy's return. Page even openly states that Glinda was a nasty, manipulative piece of work willing to play on any insecurity she could think of to worm her way in. It's pretty clear that an evil Glinda manipulates things behind the scenes in order to control events, people, and power. Now, it's harder to discuss Emerald City's Glinda as manipulative because the series was ended before it could actually end naturally. It was canceled prematurely. And because it was canceled prematurely, there were a lot of loose ends that were never tied up. I have to imagine that Glinda would have gotten to be a rounder character as the series progressed, especially since a lot of her actions seemed a little disjointed. There were times that she was evil, there were times that she was good, there were times that her husband seemed madly in love with her, there were times he seemed to prefer Dorothy. Now, what we can say without a doubt is that this Glinda comes off as fierce, she comes off as power hungry, she has an army of young witches, and she doesn't seem above sacrificing them or her sisters or her husband if it's going to help what she sees as the greater good. She comes off as an agent of the patriarchy in places. She demands chastity of the girls under her care, as if they were nuns, but she also insists that magic alone, which is a female power, is going to rule Oz. To suggest that she should be added to the evil spectrum, but since we never made it to the end, I don't really feel comfortable doing that. I'm very curious to know how the writers would have carried that out. When I first started playing around with the idea of Glinda, it really came down to if she is being free range and letting her people make choices and have agency, or if she's being that lawnmower, you must go this way, I will control all sort of Glinda. And what's interesting is as I was reworking this talk, I really noticed that who is narrating the tale and who the tale is meant for, audience-wise, plays a huge role in how we interpret Glinda. Baum wrote for children, and the post-Wiz adaptations that we're discussing really are adult tales. And this shifts things a bit. Also, while we're discussing Glinda as some sort of mother deity figure, Baum was really framing his tale where Glinda is the adultiest adult who solves the problem. Baum actually captured the child's view of the mother. She's beautiful because a child believes their mother is beautiful. And even when she uses her magic in somewhat questionable ways, like changing the appearance of the Flatheads or threatening Mombi, it's almost always because the child character has tried to solve the problem themselves. They weren't able to. They come to her and ask for her help, and being the adultiest adult, she needs to solve the problem. She's solving the child problem when a bully type won't listen to the rules or reason. What is most important here, and my big takeaway, and I don't know who else needs to hear this post-COVID or kind of at the end of COVID, wherever we are with COVID, after a year of having your plans chucked and ruined and quarantining because your kid's childcare got messed up and whatever else, is Baum's Glinda needs some me time. Baum's Glinda wants some me time. Dorothy seeks out Baum's Glinda at the end of Wonderful Wizard, which is the total opposite of the MGM Glinda, who just magics down and is like, poof, problem solved. And this is a frequent plot point that Baum uses. It is the child character that seeks out Glinda and asks for her help. Glinda is mostly in her palace with her record book, and this is why she has time to make a city for rabbits, because she's not constantly hovering in the back of her child characters' lives. She has her own life. This helps the plot, because if Glinda were there hovering in the background, the child characters probably wouldn't get to go on the adventures, but it also is good for Glinda. Her hands-off approach isn't just what makes her good, it's probably what makes her sane. And if you don't believe me, I think Baum highlights this in The Marvelous Land of Oz with the character of Ginger when she takes over the town with her army of female soldiers, and the male characters kind of freak out, and there's that quote, "Doing the housework and minding the children is wearing out the strength of every man in the emerald." So as much as we can sing the praises of the gentle guide, the mentor, the sweet mother figure, I think it's also important to remember that Mama needs some me time, and it's good for everybody in the story. Thank you for listening.